So yeah, the problem of evil is a phrase that gets used, and I think what's meant by it is what is evil? Is there such a thing as evil? Like you said it a minute ago, is it just pathology, or is it a existent force in and of itself? And obviously that's all still up for debate. There's different views on it. Generally speaking, my understanding is that the in the old world, or in the pre-modern era, or pre-enlightenment era, you know, there's always these different delineations you can make, but the general idea was that evil was a force, it was an existent thing, and there were evil spirits, demons, and humans contended with those. The general idea in Christianity is that, you know, the devil has that Satan and his his followers, his group of cohorts, have their agenda. So you've had different cultures deal with that in different ways, right? And obviously in Western culture, in the Judeo-Christian orientation, there's been that idea that Christianity and or Judaism are working sort of, are forces against the satanic forces. And I'm not a scholar on all that stuff. I'm not a biblical scholar. But generally speaking, as far as an individual's psyche and what an individual psyche is contending with, and sure enough, this one stopped.
It's evil.
Yeah.
That recorder's evil.
Obviously. I think the place I think about it from, or come from when I'm trying to talk about it, if I speak first, just like if I attempt to speak objectively as far as knowledge that I'm aware of that's out there, you know, you have these delineations that I think all kind of match up. Like I said, old world, new world, the idea of religion versus philosophy, you know, magic versus reality, even emotion versus mentality, you know, let alone imaginal versus cognitive. So there's been this shift in a lot of different aspects of life, where it was the orientation was very different than it is now. And as we all know, there's been this massive takeover of the cognitive mind and of things like logic and reason and science and materialism. And so the explanation of how things work has kind of all been filtered now through that lens. And so you know, the idea is we've sort of done away with magic, we've done away with monsters, we've done away with evil spirits, we've done away with God, we've done away with Satan, we've done away with demonic possession, we've done away with consciousness that is structured prior to the absolute free will of the intellect. And so, as I've been saying all along on this podcast, I think that's absurd, and B, I think it's a recipe for absolute disaster. And if I try to just kind of parse that out a little more, that last part I said about the absolute free will of the intellect, my understanding is that so, for example, structuralism in philosophy, you know, the idea was that there are existing structures by which we understand the world, by which we understand history. And what the post-structuralists pointed out was that, look, the structures by which we're understanding history are products of existing structures. And so we don't really get some kind of accurate sense of history or accurate sense of anything, of a text, of an object. You know, it was the point that was being made is that I think
turtles all the way down.
Yeah, right. And it's one of these things where all these things seem to line up, but I seldom hear it talked about that for example, when well, I'm trying to figure out how to not go too deep dive. Because if I kind of try to start modern and go backwards, right? It's like we have this idea in postmodernism, and post-structuralism is one of the lines of thought around postmodernism, which is that is the awakening or the awareness of, wait a second, whatever structures you're using to understand reality or a text or history, your understanding is simply a product of the structures you're using. And so, and what's to say those structures are accurate? And so it leaves us in this, you know, the conundrum of postmodernism, which is, well, then we don't really know anything. And so there's nothing to point to as far as truth, except a bunch of structures that are just results of other structures that are just results of other structures. And so if you take that, like if you say that, that's when you are talking about cognitive structures, let's say, right? Or yeah, just conceptual structures. And then if you look at, okay, but if you jump fields and you look at psychology, now we're not talking about the actual cognitive beliefs and concepts. There's a jump to, and you don't hear this talked about, and it's one of the main aspects of what I'm calling the dimension approach, which is Freud's metapsychology, which is, wait a second, how does the psyche work? Not what are the programs or what are the structures or what are the beliefs and stuff in a particular psyche, but how is it that psyches in general work? How do they operate? And so Freud's metapsychology he was trying to postulate about how the human psyche works. And he had his various models, the economic, the dynamic, the topographical. And we don't seem to debate that anymore. We've kind of adopted a certain metapsychological model, which basically negates the various ideas Freud had about how it works, and or how Jung thought it worked, and or how Eastern traditions thought it worked, and how Western mystical and occult and esoteric traditions thought it worked. Again, we've just kind of pushed all that aside and adopted the idea of logic and reason. And it's this strange thing where in modern society we're tearing down the structures, we're arguing against the oppression of structures. For example, let's say Enlightenment or colonial structures, right? The word colonial, it keeps getting used recently. It's baffling to me how we've gone back to using colonial as the sort of the marker of
White, or what is
this shit. What's that?
White? I mean, what is colonial? How do you mean it's getting brought up?
I keep hearing colonial being used as not only did the colonialists sort of ruin the world and disrupt the utopia that was going on prior to empire and colonial expansion, but that the colonialists brought a culture and a mindset, an existing set of structures that are innately oppressive, patriarchal, capitalistic, and therefore abusive and evil.
Okay.
And I'm obviously, I'm not exaggerating.
You're pro colonialism. So
I'm not like, I don't even think like the idea of pro or anti-colonialism doesn't make much sense to me.
Yeah.
Because I see it as something that went on. And see, now we're going to jump right into. But I think colonialism has been going on since the first couple of cavemen wandered over to a different part of the woods and came into conflict with some other cavemen.
Yeah, there is a structure to it.
Yeah, just it got to a point. Go ahead.
No, I just went like tying into like what you're talking about as far as structures, that like structures do build on top of each other in a way, and maybe they manifest as colonialism, but it's not that like that structure is inherently like bad, which is like, it's not about good or bad. There's something beyond like good or bad in the structure and how that develops.
Yeah. And every, the history, again, the history of war, the history of murder, the history of rape, the history of one group taking over another group, stealing their resources or incorporating them into their existing tribe.
Yeah.
This has gone on since the beginning, is my understanding. And so the colonialists, the British, for example, didn't invent any of
Yeah.
it. Nor did any of the other colonial, countries. I feel like colonial is a word that's used that at a certain point in history, the world was divided. We started using terms like colonies that were associated with nation states. But again, the process has been going on since the beginning. It's just we whether you want to call it tribes or groups or armies or however you want to group and classify humans, obviously there's been all these groups and all these competing groups that have gone on forever. And at a certain point, we arrived at nation states. And at a certain point, certain nation states were, setting out and in conflict with other areas of the world. And then there was a period where the agreement or the organization that was arrived at was that, for example, the British Empire called certain territories, colonies of theirs. And again, I just see it as this long history of different ways of dividing up land, dividing up resources, dividing up, different ways of governing. And, in the same way that the Roman Empire went out into the countryside and came to a town and basically said, this town is now, going to be a part of the Roman Empire. And, and there's all these different reasons for it. Part of it is just greed. Part of it is just bloodlust. Part of it is just, what you could say is evil. But at the same time, you could say, look, for example, the Roman Empire knew that it was threatened on all sides by invading hordes of people and by various armies, and it needed to build itself up in order to not just be subjected, to those groups.
Yeah.
And so what do you do there? It's, same thing as the military draft. There's this constant attempt to try to have organizations of people that can feel safe and that can have some kind of civilized society together. And then there's competing societies that there's conflict with. And so you have this, this ongoing, very complex interaction and ways of trying to organize.
Is there like some monad dyad aspect to it too? Like there's just a misunderstanding of like the nature of the individual that's like compensated for by this group, like this like lust for group identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. I think group identity, you hear that the research shows that belonging to a group is like paramount in the human psyche. And there's obvious evolutionary reasons to back that up. But the single human doesn't fare very well if in a society where, for example, it's you have to physically fend for yourself.
Yeah,
because the individual can't physically
right
compete against the group
or against the world.
Right.
But the kind of like structure of colonialism you're talking about is different in that it's more tied to like a libidinal drive.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm guessing it's tied to a lot of things, but not just the.
It's not just one thing.
I think there's a very higher minded aspect to it as well. I think globalism could be put in the same category, and then some people are going to say, no, globalism's an altruistic, force or idea. And it's like, well, how the hell are you going to, how are you going to globalize without, coming into contrast with certain people's way they wanted to do it? The globalists, I mean, we're getting into all kinds of huge topics here, but the push towards globalism, it's like, well, what does that mean exactly? Doesn't it mean instituting one set of laws for the whole globe?
I mean, yeah, I think so. Or like mores, or it's assuming some global identity, but like the only global identity we've ever had is like in response to a threat. So there's not really, it gets down to a different level that's much lower than like shared laws.
I think what I'm trying to get at with all these seemingly random statements is, and I think we're both kind of tracking the same here. Just where I got off track with the colonial thing was, you have this idea about structure, and then this idea that, wait a second, structures aren't necessarily accurate, or they're not necessarily absolute, or they're not necessarily right. And it's like, well, that's huge. That's that's important. And my understanding is that at a certain point in history, you weren't allowed to say that. Like if you're going to try to question the structures of your religion, or of your tribe, or of your father, or of your king, or of your priest, then you're in big, big trouble. And so the individual was not allowed to question the existing structures. And so you had these quote unquote God-given structures. And at a certain level of self-development, or if you look at spiral dynamics, at a certain level of consciousness, or if you look at Gebser's stuff, or Ken Wilber's stuff, or all the various levels, models that are out there, there's typically the level where you just take the existing structures as absolutes, and they're not to be questioned. And they're not only not to be questioned, there seems to be something in the human psyche, as far as individual development, where the force, if you will, that prevents questioning the existing structure is fear. It's not just, it's like, I don't know, force is the only word I can think of. The force that keeps it in place is fear of consequences. So on the individual basis, the kid that says, we can't do X because mom said. Mom's this absolute authority, and mom's saying it means you can't do it. And to not obey that is to risk consequence, right? And what I'm saying is we seem to have this existing structure in our own psyche that we battle with. And I'm trying to integrate like 10 different lines of thought here. Let me kind of start over and say this.
All right.
There's a difference between forces from below, let's say, developmental forces that operate in a certain way, just like in physics, right? You have some kind of life force that we don't understand. But when you put certain elements in a certain kind of configuration together, you get organic life. And it would be analogous to fire starting, right? You put certain things together and suddenly you get an explosion or you get a flame. And of course we have, chemical understandings of some of that. But prior to our chemical understandings, it just seemed like magic, And so with life, you get organic life, you get metabolism of you get a system that metabolizes and builds upon itself. And it seems to be purposive. We don't know it. We just call it the intelligence of nature. This stuff happens, and it happens by obvious laws that occur in nature. And we've studied the laws to a certain degree, and we have a certain understanding of, what makes a certain plant flourish or die, what makes a certain species of animal flourish or die. But as far as the actual organism building upon itself and the intelligence that makes that happen, it surely isn't human cognitive thought, right? It's all occurring whether we know about it or not, whether we understand it or not. In the same way that as we sit here, yours and my body seem to still be breathing and our hearts are still beating, but neither you nor I really know why. And if you start with this, there's these forces. Again, just like in physics, they're like, look, we don't even know where to start unless we just decide to start from somewhere. And so the most primary thing that we can come up with is not a particle, it's some kind of force. Which is a very important thing. They can't find the primary particle that it all came from. Rather, the deepest we can go is there's some kind of force. And then from there, okay, then we can start talking about what happens.
Yeah.
So I'm saying the same in the human psyche. There's some kind of force that seems to be there, that's primary to any structure. But then, just like in physics, you start noticing, well, wait, the way the organization starts happening is it starts to be structures built upon structures built upon structures. And if you go in there and deconstruct any of those structures, you're going to topple the whole thing. Or you're at least going to topple the structures that are above.
Yeah.
And what you might do is unleash the structures below to overtake the structures above, which is going to be, decomposition and stuff like that. and the idea is, look, this happens in the human psyche. Our awareness, our behavior, our motivation, our way of understanding, our sense of good versus bad, right versus wrong, healthy versus unhealthy, is all at least motivated by, if not determined by, these underlying structures. And so you have this weird kind of dynamic relationship between the structuralists and the post-structuralists, because a lot of times they both end up saying, that's what I'm saying. You know, because the structuralists are saying, look, there's structures, and the way that we move forward and understand things is via structures. And the post-structuralists are saying, yeah, but those structures aren't necessarily correct. And I think a lot of the structuralists are saying, yeah, but what's your point?
Yeah, it seems moot.
Yeah. And I think, well, I mean, one point is, hey, while we're dependent on structures, it's okay to go back and analyze structures, because in certain ways, maybe we can alter the structures. You know, and obviously I'm all for that. I'm not saying, look, these are the absolute structures, and because here they are in the Bible. You know, because a lot of the post-structuralists are going to say, yeah, but every motherfucker that reads the Bible is going to have a different interpretation of it. You know?
Yeah.
So even then, like, it's all. So anyway, structures in the human psyche seem to be there. I mean, it's hard to argue they're not there. The question, I think, is what do we do with them? And I think it's a mistake to think that we somehow have transcended them. I think that's bullshit. But I think a lot of modern society is acting as though we have, as though structures don't exist now. It's all social conditioning. And yes, the social conditioning causes structures, but we're starting at zero with a new human life. And it's like, no, we're not. I don't think we are. And then this idea of forces, because you have structures, but what's the force that this, you know, because that's different. If you include that there's a force, it's like, well, wait a second now, you know, we got to deal with that in a similar way that you can have a machine and it's like, okay, the machine's got all these structures and there's housing and there's gears and there's tubes and there's, you know, whatever. And it's like, well, yeah, but what's the force that makes the machine run? Is it electricity? You know, is it heat? Is it expansion? Is it, you know, what is it? Because something's got to make it go, right? The machine in itself, without the force running through it, is just an object. So what's the force in the human being? And there's different ideas about that. And the general thing you hear is, well, you know, if you're just a materialist or just a physicalist, you're going to say, well, it's just metabolic activity. Just like in a plant, there's metabolic activity going on. And that's the driving force. And that's a physical thing. It's a physical chemical reaction. And it's like, okay, you know, even if you just take that, which again I think is I'm going to jump around a little bit again. I'm going to add another element, but I think it's important they all kind of match up. So if you just take the gross physical world and you just talk, well, it's metabolism of these chemical reactions, et cetera, but we're acting as though there aren't forces, physical, chemical, electromagnetic, that exist outside our ability to perceive them yet, right? Because you don't have to go very far back in human history to where we didn't have any idea about electromagnetic force. We didn't have any idea about gravity. We didn't have any idea about, infrared. We didn't have any idea about sound waves that are actually existent and occurring, but our ears can't hear them. Light waves that are above and below our ability to see them, like all this stuff, right? So the human bandwidth at a certain point, in history, we thought, well, it's just what we can see or feel. But we've developed instrumentation that have verified, the existence of forces and activities and structures that exist and are influencing us that are outside the five senses' ability to see. But somehow we still don't think there are psychic forces that are capable of that. Right? Which just seems dumb to me. It's like, how can you be so, how can you be in denial of the possibility of that?
Yeah.
But so if you say, well, actually there are forces beyond just the metabolic influencing the human psyche. We can't point to them, we can't point to them so that you can see them within the bandwidth of what you see with your, human eyes.
Yeah.
And little by little, we're gaining the ability with instrumentation to see them. And more, there's verification that the people that say they could sense them or see them with their various extrasensory abilities, there's more and more verification that, wait a second, there's something to that, right?
Give an example of that.
Just like seeing auras and seeing colors and seeing shapes and seeing energetic activity, and then instrumentation, Kirlian photography and stuff like that. That's being developed more and more.
Okay.
So this idea that there are these forces moving, animating, motivating, driving human experience, human thought, human emotion, human motivation, human desire, human fear, and that it's not all beginning with social conditioning. Which again, another thing that baffles me, it's like, well, if you think that it's all just social conditioning and we just can completely program the human being, because it's programming, isn't it? If you're gonna say it's all just social conditioning, then aren't you saying I'm a social programmer? Then I want to socially construct society. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but so you're saying like you're going to set about the right set of structures, or
right?
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, ooh, that sounds, Nazi-esque, isn't it? Right.
Well, I mean, yeah,
but we're doing the anti-Nazi set of structures, right?
Right. There's yeah.
And they're like, yeah, but we're talking about like what's right and fair. It's like, ooh. So again, I'm just dipping my toe in a million different pools here, but
right. But you threw Nazis in just for
effect.
So you can tag it.
Yeah. So if you accept that, look, there are these forces that seem to be in us that we don't understand completely or hardly at all, but that we seem to be on the receiving end of, right? Like as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, we seem to be traveling down a stream that has a definite direction, that has a definite current to it, but we don't know the origin of the stream. We just sort of woke up at some point on this stream. We don't know where the stream's going. But we know that if we turn around and try to swim upstream, we don't tend to get anywhere. And so we're just kind of these, riders on this stream, trying to postulate, as to how we got there, what it is, where it might be going, where it might have originated from.
Yeah.
I
think that's what's tough though, is like the stream isn't a structure.
Well, that's
but
right.
People think that they're going to, like we just haven't devised the right way to go upstream.
Yeah, that's a funny way to put it. And there's debate about at what point is it not a structure? Because what you got into with Freud and Jung and Lacan and those guys is they started saying, look, there's an unconscious, and the unconscious is structured. And so then there's all these theories about, well, it's structured how? Right? What is the structure of? And in simple terms, Jung said, well, it's structured as archetypes. Lacan said it's structured as a language. Freud said it's structured as drives. Right? So there's these different ideas about how is it structured. And again, it's similar to in physics as we, got into being able to see smaller and smaller particles, we got more and more of a sense of structures. At some point we had no idea about cells, but then eventually, they had an understanding of cell structure. But then they came to understand, wait a minute, cells consist of atoms, or elements, or, electrons. Like we keep noticing these deeper, and in physics, smaller, but we're aware that they seem to build on each other. So small to large seems to be the direction, right?
Yeah.
But so, this idea of, wait a minute, what are archetypes? What is language? What are drives? What are impulses? What are instincts? What is evil? It all starts to kind of be in that same category. And what is the quality? What does it look like? What does it feel like at this level of organization versus this level? And that right there is huge. That again, our society just seems to not be taking development into account. It's like, oh, we'll look at a child and we'll say, well, there's age appropriate behavior. There's a development of the child, but like once you hit adulthood, whatever you think adulthood is, then we're all on equal ground. We're all on the same level of consciousness. We've all arrived at the same level of organization. And it's like, no, we have not.
Yeah.
And different cultures, different societies, different groups of people, same thing. They're not all on the same level. And it's not, this society might be on a higher level with regard to this aspect of life, but on a lower level with regard to some other aspect. Like it's extremely complicated.
Yeah. Well, we can't. Yeah, we don't want to understand about ourselves related to other people, and then like you want to take it like a higher level of organization to like a culture or a society or a country or a tribe or like whatever, and then it's like it's a switch that gets flipped, and then like, oh, now it's prejudice, but there's no individual acceptance of it to begin with. So then like the same conflict that we have about relating like our differences to other people's differences is like amplified in trying to explain like who is right or wrong culturally.
Right. Yeah, and I think trying to relate it to absolutely right or wrong, again, this is where I'm saying it all kind of comes back to talking about the same thing. Trying to say if a certain cultural practice is right or wrong, absolutely, it doesn't make much sense, or it's not, it's you're going to do that ad infinitum, but if you look at, well, what's going on, and what is the goal, and what needs to happen or not happen right now, right? If if your life depends on it, you're going to do certain things that you wouldn't do if your life didn't depend on it, right? You're gonna it's funny, an example that's coming to mind is a relative of mine, apparently I heard, owned some houses in Iowa during the Great Depression, was starting to make pretty good money off of renting out. He owned like 30 homes. But then the Great Depression hit, and there was such economic despair that not only did his renters not pay the rent they owed on the houses, they burned the cupboards to stay warm. And so it's like a level of, a level of poverty and suffering that, like, I've never even had a glimpse of.
Yeah, right.
But it comes to mind as, like, you could say, well, look, burning the cupboards is wrong. It's bad, especially when you don't even own the home, and it's obviously not a good idea, because where are you going to store stuff, right? And it's like, yeah, but if you're freezing to death, you got to burn the cupboards, right?
Yeah.
And there's just infinite examples of where you got to override one, truth for another. And we just have to, I think we have to look through that lens always, right? Like, well, wait a second, what's going on, and why, and what's the goal, and what are the things we're going to have to do or accept or tolerate at the moment because of a higher order or a higher need or a more pressing thing. And then, of course, there's the flip side of at what point do you sacrifice for an ideal? But again, I think the model needs to include that all this stuff's relative, which really is in alignment with the post-structuralist view, right? That it's dependent and relative.
Yeah. But it's not relative and pointless.
Right.
Like there's just there's a deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction versus, like you're saying, like a critique.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I know I need to wrap this up.
Your internal wrap-up timer went off.
Well, I know that you said you got to go a little early, and it's already 11:30.
Oh, no worries. I mean, I do, but that was just a funny.
So through all this, I'm trying to say, my sense is there are forces that we don't quite understand that seem to exist, and we, at a certain level of consciousness, meaning a certain level of organization in the human psyche, meaning developmentally at a certain level, the human psyche is going to experience forces that appear destructive to that person's existing structures that they see as good. They're going to experience those destructive forces as evil. In the same way that the wild animal that is trying to kill you at a certain, it's easy to feel like that's evil, coming to get me. The person that watches the wild animal kill their family and eat them is going to have a hard time, not seeing that animal as evil.
Yeah.
Especially the further back in history you go, meaning especially the further down in level of consciousness you go. The 5-year-old that watches the wild animal bite them, or watches them bite someone else, or watches them take away, even take away their food, the domestic dog that comes and eats the 5-year-old's ice cream cone.
Evil dog.
Yeah, evil. And then of course in modern day, it's like, well, they're not evil, it's just nature. And the lion, ate that human, or, ate that woman's baby, because that's how the lion operates. It's natural for the lion. And maybe the human shouldn't have been where the lion was. And, and you get all this very confusing, multi-leveled stuff going on. And then of course you go, why do we live in a world where lions would eat babies? Like, why is it even a thing? Why, this must be an evil place if God made it like that, right?
Yeah.
Or nature must just be evil if nature is like that. And so of course we get very, again, all the kind of the primary questions that come up for people. So I think in all this, again, I'm saying I think the human psyche operates via forces. The forces move through structures so that those forces express in very different ways depending on what structures they run through. And so I'm all for building more and more complex, more and more higher order structures that seem to empower the human being not only to survive, but to accurately see and comprehend reality. And I'm an optimist in that I think that, it's this strange thing. It's like we build structures that become more and more capable of looking back and understanding the underlying structures. Right? It's just sort of an amazing thing. But also not just that we understand the underlying structures, but that also give us more and more of a sense of what may be, what higher structures there may be that we aren't yet in touch with directly. Or maybe we're only in touch with them intuitively. Maybe our ego mind hasn't been able to download it and somehow kind of accept it, but there's an intuitive sense of its existence, right? In the same way that, well, we can feel this heat, and perhaps there's a big, energy source that the heat comes from, and it's like, oh, and then at a later point, look, there's this big yellow ball in the sky that, meaning we can sense stuff before we maybe can see it, right?
Yeah.
So forces that move through structures that build upon themselves. But it's very important to not just take the leading edge of structure as the all, to not think we've arrived at the ultimate structure.
Yeah.
And to not decide that, no, all the previous structures don't exist, they're bullshit. It's also a mistake to think that every human being is at the top level structure. Whatever that, if there is a top level structure, not every human being is there. And then it gets more complicated. Even human beings that, let's say, are there, which again, I don't even know what that means exactly to say that, right? But let's say a human being is there. At any given moment, that human being might not be coming from that structure.
Right.
If the higher structure is altruistic love towards everyone, right? And let's say a person really arrives at that and really even feels that sometime, let alone has it as an ideology. It doesn't mean they're coming from there 5 minutes from now.
Yeah. In traffic.
Yeah, right. And they may come from a very low one. And there's going to be patterns. That person might come from there when they're sitting on a pillow in front of a crowd that worships them as some enlightened being. They can sit and very calmly speak about, love. But as soon as that person walks off stage and is encountered with some mundane frustration, they may fly into a borderline rage.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera. It's like we need to like keep that in mind, right? We also need to keep in mind that the person that flies into a borderline rage and is mean or angry or even shouts a bunch of sexist, racist, fascist, type of ideas isn't necessarily only capable of that level of consciousness. They might be in an unconscious triggered regression, and that's what came out. And so we need to not just label that person as some kind of monster. We need to accurately try to get a sense of the layers and say, okay, look, this person's coming from here right now. But we need to not just say, because we're kind of doing a thing of whatever the lowest level someone exhibits or speaks, or maybe even it seems like maybe they might be kind of saying something that's from there, then we label them that, and we can't, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, as far as the models, you see how I'm trying to kind of tie it all together, that structuralism and libidinality and evil and social issues and development and organization and healing and awakening, all that I'm saying that the models, we seem to be using a model that isn't including those things. It's not including forces. It's not including libidinality. It's not including the idea of evil. It's not including development even. It's not including structures.
Yeah.
And I'm saying we got to go back to that, not go back to the Middle Ages, not go back to the early 1900s. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we can't just do away with it all. We got to build upon it.
There's some just this idea of the forces and the idea of what actually binds us together, or what we actually have common identity around or common experience of. And it's the force and not the structure.
Right.
So
yeah, well put. Yeah.
There are groups that have a structural similarity, right? You have 1,800 online quizzes you could take right now to determine all the different groups you experience similar structures to. But the group identity that we're running from seemingly is the force or the stream, and not the individual interpretation of it. So like you said, we're developing these more and more advanced ways of looking back at the structure. But again, it's like you said, we could identify with that and just keep moving up in our conceptual understanding of what all the underlying issues are, or start moving down towards what is this river we're all drowning in, or running down, or grabbing onto logs on the side, or running into rocks. There's all of these things that are actually more similar than, you know, a global code of ethics.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you know, along that line, the force, just in simple terms, that force from below, I think is ideally met by a force from above, so to speak.
Mm.
And that generally speaking, you have this interaction between the two, a destructive and a constructive force. You have, I do think that love is the highest order that the human being has sort of come up with and achieved as far as an idea about that the force, the highest force the human being is in touch with is love. And that I do think love is a force. I mean, love, who knows what love ultimately is, but if you say that one of the things you can experience love as is a force, you know, and it's, well, how does that work? How does this deconstructive force that seems to be the force that causes entropy, right? Which physicists have decided is the primary movement of things, right?
Yeah.
And then again, it's like, well, why do we get all this anti-entropy stuff happen, right? Like what's causing that?
Yeah.
And then you get into, you know, and then there's ideas about dark matter and dark energy and all this stuff that, but so I think that's an important aspect is, okay, like you said, if it's not about the structures, it's about the force. But then what is the force? And it's easy to say, geez, the force seems evil, right? The force seems to be this aggressive, violent force that in nature that makes everything's trying to take over everything else. Every species is trying to take over every other species, you know, and feeds off it.
Yeah.
Like it's fucking food. It's like, yeah, no, it literally is food, right? Like species are, you know, everything is using everything else as food. And it's like, well, man, what's, you know, the primary force seems to be this absolute battle for domination and to devour everything else. And so it's like, man, it's easy to say that, you know, get real fatalistic about it or nihilistic or whatever, and just say that, man, you know, this whole thing's fucked.
Yeah.
And why is it better, you know? Well, so it's like, is there some counter force to that? Is there some reason? Is there some deeper meaning? Is there some higher level of organization that we can't see from where we look? It just seems fucked up.
Yeah.
But there's a higher level of organization that, you know, that exists, that's somehow beautiful, or somehow is real, or somehow true, or somehow has higher meaning. And then you get into either, you know, very positive philosophies about life, or you get into spirituality. And I'm certainly not trying to speak against any of that. I'm very much
for it,
you know, about I'm not only like rooting for that to be the case, but my direct experience in my psyche is that that's indeed the case. And that, you know, and then it's hard to talk about it without getting real religious. It's like, and I've felt directly force, and not just force, but structured force arise in my psyche and take over my physical, emotional, and mental functioning in a way that I became painfully aware that my ego mind is not the master in its own home, which is the way Freud puts it, right? I became terrifyingly aware of that and and as well as, oh geez, if I drink too many beers, or if I smoke too much pot, or if I do too much mushroom, I'm no longer cognitively, in the usual way I call self, and the way I usually see truth and see whatever. It's like, no, it takes me over.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, duh. It's like, yeah, but we seem to operate like that's not the case.
Significant.
Yeah, like that's not significant.
Yeah.
And then I've had the same thing occur, but in a very different way, in what seems like from above. And same thing. It's like, oh, and then I'm overcome in that way.
Yeah.
And not just in a way where, like, well, if I get cold enough, yeah, I can't quite function the way I can if I am at a comfortable temperature. Like if it's too cold or if it's too hot, right? They both affect you in these different ways. And yes, they can overtake your normal function, right?
Yeah.
Not just physical functioning, but mental, emotional function. And it's like, yeah, that's a very good analogy of, even on the gross level, just temperature, and it doesn't have to be so hot that it burns you alive. It just can get hot enough to where you no longer remain, what would be considered cognitively sane, right?
Yeah.
So again, just the idea that love is a force, or is a something, I'm calling it a force, and that there's also seems to be some force that's counter to that I think exists in a dialectic, that
Right.
the human consciousness is capable of experiencing as a dialectic, and not just conceptually saying that, but literally experiencing it as a dialectic. And if and when that happens, everything changes. That's awakening. Prior to that, it doesn't make sense.
Mm.
But that there's a actual change that can happen in the human psyche, to where you become capable of dialectical thinking, capable of dialectical experience. And again, it's that experience is more real, it's more accurate. You become aware that the previous non-dialectical configuration was I want to say an extrapolation of the, out of the oneness of the dialectic. I don't know if I'm using that word right, but that when you get to that dialectical state, it seems that then and only then, and this is the last point I'll try to make, because when you say, wait a second, because I feel like I'm stating a bunch of obvious things in the last hour. I'm not stating anything new. I'm just pointing out, I feel like I'm saying, you guys, fire's hot and it can like destroy things, and water can get cold enough to where it actually crystallizes and freezes. I feel like I'm just saying shit like that. But then I'm saying, okay, why aren't we including some of these basic concepts in how we see the world, and how we see self, and how we see psychology, and how we see society? Why aren't we doing that? Because it takes a dialectical viewpoint, which again, the word's paradoxical, because the dialectic is not a viewpoint, but a dialectical understanding, in order to accept that kind of model.
Yeah. I think that would maybe we'll come back to that. So I feel like because again, you're talking about how we move towards that, and then kind of going back into so it's coming from two places. We have two different understandings from two different places coming together to reveal something that we, like you said, it's not we're born into a misunderstanding of it. It's you have to grow into an understanding of it.
Yeah.
And so next time talk about, you said, how, at least from below, it moves up towards that as it's distilled.
Yeah.
Experientially.